Good morning, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the last panel. I think it gave us a very good perspective, a bipartisan perspective on where things stand on the services-related portions of the trade agenda. And so, again, hope you enjoyed comments of congressional staff. And now we want to turn to a discussion of Brexit. And we're very pleased to have with us today Gary Campkin from TheCityUK, which champions UK-based financial and professional services. And we also have Sally Jones, who is a director at Deloitte UK, where she serves as an expert on international trade and tax-related issues related to the UK's withdrawal from the EU. And of course, the UK's decision in June indicating its public's desire to withdraw from the European Union has created a great deal of uncertainty. And so what we wanted to be able to do today is to have our experts discuss the ramifications for not only the UK itself, but also the EU and partners around the world. So what we'd like to do is to have Gary and Sally each give an overview from their perspective, and then we'll get into some specific questions. And so Gary, I'll turn to you first. I was hoping you could focus on giving us an update from the UK perspective on where things stand and what is likely to happen once negotiations start with the EU in March. And it would also be useful to hear whether the UK is expecting to have to renegotiate its trade commitments, whether bilateral or multilateral. And also what messages you're giving to your business community, particularly the financial services sector. So Gary, let me turn to you first.
Well, thank you, Christine. It's a real pleasure to be back in Washington at this event. I think the first thing to say is to reinforce what the Prime Minister herself has been very clear on, that Brexit means Brexit. So no later than March 2017, the Article 50 process will be triggered, which will start a 2-year negotiation for the United Kingdom to formally leave the European Union. But there are, in fact, 3 negotiations. And there are discussions about how many negotiations there actually are, but 3, in my view, are really important. There's the Article 50 negotiation, which is the nature of the withdrawal. There's the negotiation about the new relationship between the UK and the EU 27. And then there's, key and crucially for financial and related professional services, but not exclusively so, the transition agreements. We think it's absolutely vital that there's clarity on transition arrangements, not just at the start of the Article 50 process, but also at the end of the negotiation process as one set of relationships defined in the current circumstances move to the new set of relationships. So, it will happen. The British government is currently reaching out to the business community and other stakeholders to determine its position. I think the EU 27 need to do the same thing, because a negotiation is not just about what the UK wants, it's about what the EU 27 want as well. So there will be a need to define positions very carefully from both sides in order to engage effectively. And from the financial and related professional services industry's perspective, there are a number of things which are key and crucial. Firstly, stability and certainty to the extent possible. And this is particularly important, not just for the UK and for the EU 27, but also for the global business community. And we've seen helpful interventions from the United States, from Japan and others, encouraging both sides to ensure that they approach this process in the right way with a view to creating the right results. Secondly, it is really important that we focus in on mutual market access. So again, there's been a lot of talk, a lot of speculation about the UK keeping access in some shape or form to the single market. But it's also about the access that the EU 27 have into the UK. London is not just the global financial centre, we would say the leading international financial centre along with New York, but it's also Europe's financial centre. And there are a whole range of issues that the EU 27 need to think about in terms of access to London, for the manufacturers, access to the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world. So this is about mutual market access. The next really important issue is about the nature of the new relationship itself, and also how the UK then begins to negotiate trade investment relationships with its partners. And Angela and congressional colleagues mentioned the resolution that was before Congress. We welcomed that intervention. Of course, it's going to be very important for the UK to look at both developed and emerging economies and to move forward with the negotiation of next generation agreements, embracing new issues. We believe this is a major opportunity for the UK and for its trade investing partners. So I'll stop there, and I'm sure we'll pick up some other more detailed issues in questions.
Well, thanks very much, Gary. Now, Sally, it would be useful to hear from the U.S. private perspective how and whether Brexit is changing the way that you're doing business and you're dealing with your clients. And if it's not too sensitive, if you can comment on whether it's changed the way you have located your operations, if any of them have moved out of the UK or to other member states, and whether you see your clients moving out of the UK to other member states, and generally how you're advising your clients to respond to Brexit.
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you very much for having us. As a Brit, it's a pleasure to get to 10 o'clock in the morning without having Brexit mentioned already. It is typically the hot topic at the moment. So I think that UK business has done a pretty decent job so far of accepting the vote. It may not have been what British business would have chosen, but accepting the vote and getting on with, for want of a better term, business as usual. We have at least 2 years until the UK leaves the EU. There is an awful lot of trade and investment to be done in that 2-year period. Speaking for Deloitte, we've seen an increased interest from our clients on all matters to do with trade and government affairs and public policy more generally. It's caught businesses' attention in a way that is absolutely unprecedented, I think, in my 20 years of business experience. But companies aren't yet taking action if they can possibly avoid it. So companies are very much adopting a wait-and-see approach because the extent of uncertainty is so enormous that it's very, very difficult for companies to know how to react. That's true for the majority. There are a small minority where their commercial facts and circumstances might force a decision sooner than they would perhaps have chosen. So if you are a big manufacturer of kit and you know that you want your next production line to roll off in 2019, which means you need to start building your factory in 2017, you need to decide today where you're going to build it. And that's the kind of company where decisions are being forced upon them sooner rather than later. But the majority are waiting to see what will happen. They're drawing up contingency plans, for sure. So they are doing all kinds of different scenario analyses to work out if we had an EEA-type relationship, what would that mean for my business? If we were trading on WTO terms, what would that mean for my business? But they'll defer those decisions until the last moment that they can, I think.
In terms of how you both are viewing the future, and again, relating to how, in Gary, your case, you advise your members, and Sally, with you, your clients, what sort of potential future relationships do you envision might occur as a result of the negotiations with the EU? Are there different scenarios that you play out for clients? And if so, at this point, to the extent you can predict, what do you think is the most realistic one?
The answer to the first part of your question is yes. There's been a lot of work done, including by the TTIP, into looking at the precise nature of the relationship and the impact that it might have on UK-based financial and related professional services. I think the reality is that membership of the single market is probably not going to happen. The political imperative is such that is likely. We believe, however, that it's important to approximate as closely as possible the current set of relationships. But nonetheless, we've done a whole range of scenario planning that goes from Norwegian models, Swiss models, right the way through to WTO. And I should just say at this point, before I go on to say a couple of other things, because I've heard, even in the time that I've been here in Washington, some question marks about whether the UK is or is not a member of the WTO. It is a member of the WTO. So let's just clear that one up once and for all. The reality, however, is that I think the negotiation will lead to a bespoke British model. The UK, fifth or sixth largest economy in the world, with very particular sets of circumstances, particularly in our industry. This will require a bespoke British model which will reflect the circumstances of the UK and indeed the UK's relationship to the EU27. Oliver Wyman did some work for us which tried to calibrate this. So it didn't do anything on related professional services, but on straight FS. The value to the UK economy is about 200 billion a year. Of that, about a quarter is EU related. So 75% is either international business or domestic related. So 25% is the bit which is EU related. And then one can have a look at a range of scenarios and see how that 25% was going to impact the UK. And it ranges from, closely to the approximation scenario I mentioned to you, a loss of 2 to 3 billion plus 2,000 to 3,000 jobs, to WTO, which would go to potentially with a multiplier to something like 70,000 jobs, or indeed more closely to the upper end of that 25%. And obviously on that scale, depending on where you come up, there's a different impact. But the reality is, I think it's up to the negotiators, and it's really important that both sides, as I said before, both sides focus in on what is important and negotiate the right deal for the UK, the right deal for the EU27, and the right deal for the global economy.
And Sally, from your perspective, are there any different options? You mentioned the Swiss model, for example, and I know that that's one that comes up frequently. And the sensitivity there, of course, is the immigration issue and how that's treated. So from your perspective, do you think one model may be more likely than another?
I have to say, I completely agree with Gary. I think we'll end up with a bespoke free trade agreement. I'm perhaps a little bit less optimistic than Gary about the transition period. My big fear is that we end up with a WTO trading period before we get to a ratified free trade agreement for the UK. And the news on CETA, the Canadian-European Free Trade Agreement, and the fact that it was voted down by one of the Belgian regional assemblies this week is unhelpful, shall we say, in terms of the ability for the UK to see a ratified free trade agreement anytime soon. And what we advise our clients is to look at, I was going to say worst case and best case, but that's politically charged. So let's say the case that's closest to the current situation and the case which is furthest away from the current situation. So EEA on one hand, the Norway answer, and then on this hand, the WTO answer. On the basis, if you can work out what a Norwegian light would look like for your business, and you can work out what a WTO would look like for your business, then any decision within those parameters which comes up with a good answer is a decision you can make without regrets. and therefore one that you can make safely. Anything that gives a decision outside of those parameters, that gives something you don't like, you have to be very wary about taking. But we find that once companies start focusing on what the scenarios would mean, rather than the probability of each of those scenarios arising, then they can start to have constructive dialogues about where they're going to go. If you spend your whole time saying, oh, well, we don't think EEA is very likely, or WTO would be a disaster, then you sort of start getting bogged down in probabilities, and that's not helpful to anybody. Anecdote for you, though, is that we started calling scenario planning Brexit wargaming. And then we got a very testy call from a civil servant in the Cabinet Office saying that wargaming sounded really quite violent and could we find a better name for it. So now it's our Brexit scenario planning laboratory, but they were very upset about us calling it that, so we had to change it.
Could I just pick up one point, Christine, that you mentioned in introducing the last question, because I think it is important, and immigration has been a touchstone issue in the referendum. But for our industry, the movement of skilled people, and actually not just in and out of the EU, but globally, is absolutely crucial. And if you have and accept the premise of a global financial centre, you have to have access to global talent, not just for the UK headquartered companies who will want to draw in from all around the world, but also for those inward investors who come to London and the UK because it offers that capacity, because it offers a talent pool, a peer identification group. So I think immigration and movement of people will be a key issue. We've made it very clear to government that the movement of skilled people is an absolutely essential part of the new relationship. As I say, not just in the EU27 dynamic, but also more globally.
But one of the issues with Brexit is because it's so unclear exactly what the British public did vote for. And it's immigration, and in fact we shouldn't really talk about migration in the context of free movement of persons, but movement of people into the UK was clearly one of the key issues on which the referendum was fought. But nobody really understands exactly what the British public meant by wanting to put curbs on migration. And there was a survey done by the Independent newspaper last weekend, for example, which showed that 49% of the people they polled put access to the single market as the single most important Brexit issue, and only 39% chose closing the UK's migration borders as being the most important issue. So it's not at all clear, I think, to me or to the politicians or to the media exactly what it is that the British public did vote for. And that's one of the issues with not understanding really what it is that we now need to implement.
You mentioned the WTO model, and I think it would be useful for the audience to maybe just speak for a minute about what that would exactly entail in terms of moving forward with relations between the UK and the EU.
Well, the first point to make, of course, is that Gary is entirely right, that the UK has membership of the WTO in its own right, but all of our WTO terms were negotiated by the EU as a bloc. So one of the things that we have in front of us is the need to regularise our WTO position. Before the referendum, DG Azevedo was making some fairly aggressive press statements along the lines that the UK would have to renegotiate all of its terms line by line, much as if it was acceding to the WTO. And we know from recent negotiations, Liberia, for example, the 162nd country to accede, that those negotiations take a very long time. My hope is that in reality, as a practical matter, we will be able to agree with the WTO that many of our terms can simply port across into UK schedules. But even so, that would still create a situation where movements of goods between the UK and the EU member states, and in fact the members of the EU Customs Union, would have to have tariffs imposed on them in very many instances. And you know as well as we do how complicated a WTO tariff schedule looks, and that just negotiating those alone will be a big task. But then you've also got all of the other annexes to the WTO core text that need to be considered on a paragraph by paragraph basis. And all of that needs to be done in parallel or after our EU negotiations have been done. So trading on WTO terms is probably about as hard a Brexit as one could possibly imagine, and from a pure business perspective, one to be avoided if we possibly can.
I just make a couple of comments, if I may, about Geneva. I think the attitude in Geneva is different to that in the run-up to the referendum. And again, I think this is reflective of the fact that the British people have made a decision. It will happen, but all of us have a vested interest in ensuring that the right result comes out of this for the global economy. So I think what I'm hearing in Geneva is a much more positive set of messaging from the Secretariat and from members. Of course, it's a difficult process, but it need not be insurmountable. And I think, if you're looking at the size and scale and impact of the British economy, and indeed the impact that this has on the EU, another major WTO member, then again, it's important and imperative to get this right as quickly as possible with as least disruption, and that has to be the focal point.
Agreed.
Related to that, it would be interesting to hear your views about how things are going with the new Theresa May administration. And the various departments that have been set up to deal with Article 50, and how you see that playing out as the negotiation is launched.
So you're right, Christine. The Prime Minister made some what are called machinery of government changes. She set up a department for exiting the EU, which is a department, in a sense, whose job is to negotiate itself out of business. It will be responsible for the Article 50 process. And David Davis, the Secretary of State, whom we've met and with whose officials we're in close contact, is very much on listening mode. He wants to understand what our issues are as he thinks about the UK's negotiating strategy. There is a new Department for International Trade too. And for those of us like myself who've been in this game for a long time, actually the UK having a Department of International Trade is a good move. I think it focuses on a key part of our national interest. And Liam Fox there is focusing on outreaching to do some spade work on the new sets of relationships that will have to be negotiated. It's no particular secret, but there's already been an agreement with Australia, with New Zealand and with India for exploratory discussions on the nature of the new relationship. So although, while it's absolutely right that the UK cannot negotiate new arrangements before it leaves the EU, I see no reason why exploratory discussions can't be undertaken. And then, of course, as the Foreign Office, as the last of the big three ministries led by the Brexiteers. What I would also say is that the Prime Minister herself is taking a very close look and supervisory role on this process. There's a cabinet committee which has been set up to encompass not just those ministries but the other ministries that have a particular locus too. So very strong sense in government of alignment on deciding what the UK priorities are, reaching out to stakeholders, and preparation for the Article 50 process, and indeed what happens after that.
Because, of course, the Prime Minister has a very tough balancing job, because she's got 100 or so very anti-Europe Brexiteer MPs on one hand, and 100 or so equally pro-Remain MPs on the other hand, and she has quite a job to walk the tightrope to keep both sides happy.
How are you dealing with the argument that has been made in some contexts that Brexit amounts to Britain turning its back on the rest of the world? This has come up on and off in the discussion of Brexit. So from both of your perspectives, obviously Sally, in your case, you have a lot of international clients, and obviously with the TheCityUK, your members have a lot of international ties and outreach. So what do you say when that kind of argument is raised?
I think the answer is pretty simple. Look at the UK's record. The UK has always been an outward-looking, open, transparent trading and investment nation. That is not going to change. And indeed, it's in our interests for it not to change, and it's in the interests of key trading partners in the global economy for it not to change. And I honestly do not see any sign across government at all that that is the case. And it's certainly not what the business community wants or expects.
And many of the things that made the UK a great place to do business 3 months ago are still there. The conditions are still in place. We still have decent infrastructure, good education, an educated workforce, common language with the US among others, geographical proximity to Europe. Trying to explain to my 3 children that just because we're leaving the EU doesn't mean we're physically leaving the EU is quite tricky. But all of these things do matter, and those key parts of infrastructure are still in place.
Yeah, agree with that.
Well, I want to leave opportunity for questions. So I want to open it up to the audience. And so I see at least one hand up already, right over here.
Hi, thanks. Andy Olson with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I wanted to ask about TTIP. Seems to me that once the UK invokes Article 50, it would be inappropriate for the Commission to continue negotiating a trade agreement with the US on behalf of the UK. So I'm just wondering, at that point, shouldn't it become essentially a 3-party agreement with the US, the UK, and the EU? And I know you mentioned that EU rules prevent the UK from actually negotiating and concluding trade agreements until you actually exit. But I'm just wondering how you essentially reconcile that. And I mean, obviously well, let me just say the US administration, I think, has suggested that the UK goes to the back of the line. That's a little worrying given the depth of the UK-US trade and investment relationship. So I'm just wondering, how do you essentially, well, I'd just like your opinion as to how you, well, whether that would be a good idea, essentially become a 3-party agreement, or at least a negotiation.
Well, the first point that I would make, in no particular order, is that as long as the UK is a member of the EU, then we're obliged to be loyally cooperative. And that means that we have to act as a full member of the EU in every respect, including in trade negotiations, in justice matters, in defence, any of the dossiers you care to mention. The UK is still a loyally cooperative member of the EU and will remain so until whatever time that we eventually leave. Against that context, that it's not just TTIP that the UK has to concern itself with. There are any number of other free trade agreements where the UK only has access because of our membership of the EU, and where it would make sense for the UK to either come on board as a third member of those trade agreements or replicate its terms as closely as it possibly can. I entirely hear what you're saying about the importance of US-UK trade. And I would agree with you, but I also think TISA is going to be really important for the UK, partly because it looks like TISA is going to become concluded more rapidly than other of the trade agreements, and because, just as with the US, services is such an important part of our economy. It's as big for the UK economy as it is for the US economy. So I think it's really, that would be another way that we could access a free trade agreement that would give us a lot of, not all, but a lot of what we need.
The TheCityUK has been on record and remains very clear in its views about the value and need for the United Kingdom to be involved in high-value, high-standards trade and investment agreements. And that has been a challenge in some quarters, but nonetheless, it's one of the things that we will need to look very closely on, as I hinted at, in the future. I absolutely agree with Sally. You know, we are part of the EU until we leave the point of departure. I think there are some challenges around the 53, I think it is, trade investment agreements that the EU has with other countries that, as Sally said, define currently the UK's access. There's also a point here, and I'll come back to the specific question in a second, but there is a point here about what other trading partners will also do. Because, of course, with the UK leaving the EU, that could potentially change the balance of those negotiations. or those negotiated agreements. So I think there is a whole range of things that need to be thought through very carefully on that point. On TTIP, I mean, for 25, 30 years, I've been arguing for an effective, high standard, high value transatlantic marketplace, transatlantic trade investment agreement. I would hope that TTIP can be concluded in those terms as soon as possible, almost regardless of Brexit negotiation timetables. But in the new dynamic, the UK-US relationship will be key. I can see it potentially being maybe easier to negotiate on issues like regulatory coherence between the UK and the US as a bilateral, where things like subsidy compliance and mutual recognition and all of those things are perhaps easier to do. So I think there's a huge potential out there. It's an excellent question, and I don't have a specific answer, but it will be what it will be up until the point that the UK leaves.
Other questions?
Some back there.
Thank you. Ken Propp, Business Software Alliance. One of the benefits that the single market has brought to the UK has been the possibility for the free flow of data between the UK and the European Union. That presumably will disappear with a departure from the single market unless a separate arrangement is negotiated on that front between the UK and the European Union. Is this an issue that is important to companies that you are advising? What sort of advice are you giving them about it? And finally, to what extent do you think that the UK's different approach to surveillance issues from European continental countries will have an impact on its ability to ensure free data flows to Europe? Thank you.
So you're absolutely right. Data is one of those really critical issues for the UK, and indeed for a company like mine, where if we can't send emails cross-border, then it becomes very difficult to do business. We currently have various EU regulations and directives which have been transposed into UK law. They remain in UK law until such time as Parliament repeals them. And you may have heard that Theresa May announced at the Conservative Party conference what's been called the Great Repeal Bill, which is intended to, in effect, take away European law but dump it wholesale into UK legislation if it isn't already in there. So in fact, it's not really a repeal bill at all. It's in fact a bring it all in one place bill. And so we can deal with it as and when we need to. The data protection directives are going to be replaced by the General Data Protection Regulation, which is effective soon. We will be obliged to bring that into UK law before we leave the EU. So that will have force in the UK exactly as it would in any other EU member state. The question, as you rightly say, is what's going to happen when we leave the EU? Whether we have something a little bit like Privacy Shield that would give people very similar rights to those that are now in place between the US and the EU. I would imagine that might well be a road that we go down, that or something similar, because it's a trodden path that people don't need to think about too many times over compared to all the other issues where we're in completely uncharted water.
Other questions?
Hello, Carmen Lucero with Microsoft. I appreciate the point you made about how you have to explain to your kids that leaving the EU didn't literally mean leaving the European Union, because the way that the debate has sort of been structured, I think it does actually kind of make sense that people voted for the British Isles literally floating away from continental Europe. Of course, that's not possible. However, I think you see that same kind of dynamic in trade discussions both in the United States and across the world. So it's very much seems to be framed in sort of a yes-no, pro-globalization, anti-globalization, pro-trade, anti-trade, et cetera, sort of debate, when of course the reality is much more complicated. And so I think that's why when you had the decision, there's all this uncertainty, business is kind of going on as usual, but people don't really know what's going to happen. So learning from this experience going forward, do you have any advice in terms of how we as a global community can talk about trade and these sorts of issues in a way that doesn't seem so black and white?
I think many of the important points were made by our previous panellists, actually. And I also completely reiterate their viewpoint that services are underrepresented in the discussion, generally speaking, in trade. So in a slightly derogatory way, politicians quite like high-vis jackets and hard hat photo opportunities, but having your photo taken with a bunch of accountants is nothing like so exciting. How we make accountants exciting, with Gary and I as key examples, is really quite hard to do, but we need to. No offence, Gary.
Are you allowed to do that?
But coming back to your question, and is the UK turning its back on the global economy? No, we're not. Are we still open for business? Yes, we are. Will we do what it takes to make sure that we get to the right answer? Yes, ultimately we will, whether that means better data localization or a better way of transcribing laws into the UK, or in fact recognising that some of what the EU does is really helpful and useful, and we can learn from that in the same way that the EU can learn from us. So hopefully we'll get to the right answer.
I think I'd just add this, and we started a piece of work before the referendum with McKinsey about looking at the threats and opportunities to UK-based financial and related professional services. We obviously held that report until after the referendum result, and it was altered a little bit, but not substantially. And I think one of the key messages here is that there are a whole range of issues that not just the UK, but all of us are facing, whole ranges of challenges that our industry need to address. And I think from my perspective, getting on the front foot more, explaining more about what we do, how we do it, the fact that our industry, okay, it doesn't make stuff, it doesn't grow stuff, but it enables things. It enables things to happen. And we need to, I think, be much more proactive in engaging with the arguments that some on the other side of the table, NGOs and others, try to put forward to skew the debate for one particular outcome. We have to be more self-confident in our own arguments and going out there and explaining what we do and the value that it brings in terms of the jobs, the job base, the tax take, the fact that if I look at the UK, FRPS is about 12% of the economy, the largest tax-paying economy, the largest export sector. Those facts just need to be rammed home. 2.2 million people across the United Kingdom are in financial and related professional services. When I started this job 3 years ago, the most staggering fact for me was that for every job in London, the magnet in the industry, there are 2 created in the rest of the country. So again, we've got to get more sophisticated about explaining how we impact local communities. And also, let's be honest about this, part of the rationale behind the referendum vote, part of the debate that you're seeing here in the United States in the election, part of the issue that will be facing the French and the German elections next year, is a pushback against elites, however defined. And we need to address those issues. We need to respond to the public debate in a way which explains what we do in a much more personal and relevant way.
We're just about out of time, but what I wanted to end on is, Sally, you mentioned in the beginning that certainly from a business perspective, there was a regret about the Brexit vote. But despite that, and dealing with the reality that the vote did occur the way that it did, are there opportunities in particular for the services industry, perhaps coming out of the negotiations as they proceed?
Well, I think one of the opportunities is that for the UK economy in particular, if we have a choice between how to drive up productivity, for example, one way to do that, or at least the way to preserve a profit margin, is cheap labour. And we've been able to rest on using cheap labour from Eastern Europe to do things like construction, haulage, distribution, many of the lower value end jobs in the economy. That's going to be a challenge going forward. It seems almost certain that we won't have free movement of people, which will force the UK to innovate. It will force the UK to find more creative and more innovative ways of constructing houses or moving goods or delivering services. And there is some truth in necessity being the mother of invention, and I think we may see a slew of creative solutions coming out over the next 5 to 10 years.
From my perspective, again, let me go back to what I said at the beginning. We respect the decision of the United Kingdom electorate, and we need now to really focus in on the opportunities and addressing the threats and risks. But in terms of opportunities, what is clear to me is that the UK has, throughout its history, found innovative ways of doing things, about connecting itself to the world, whether that's law, contract law is still English law. London is the major centre for dispute and arbitration. We have the language, we have the time zone, we have a flexible and adaptable workforce. All the things that Sally mentioned in terms of making the UK an attractive destination for FDI. As someone who spent most of his career in trade and investment negotiations, I actually think it's quite exciting. Because we have the chance to define something new. We have the chance to really grapple with new opportunities, new issues, next generation agreements. And if what this does is to give the UK an opportunity with trading partners that want to come along on that journey with us, the opportunity to redefine and to grasp some of these issues effectively, then I see that just as a big plus.
Great. Well, on that uplifting note, I'd like you to join me in thanking Gary and Sally for a very lively discussion. Thank you so much. And we'll now get ready for our next panel.
Thank you very much, Gary and Sally and Christy, for that terrific panel. It always is good to be reminded how deep the Brexit issues run. They're coming up in the privacy shield sector. They're coming up in TISA, in TTIP, from the perspective of the non-life insurance industry, and I'm sure my life insurance colleagues would agree, in the US-EU covered agreement negotiations, and not to mention the geopolitical ramifications of Brexit. So thank you all very much for that wonderful panel. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a short 10-minute coffee break, but we have a very tight program, so I'd ask you to please be back in the room at 10:40. Thank you very much.